Welcome to Detective Reddington's office. Take a seat and listen to this story. It will be interesting. When I married Rachel, I never imagined our life would become a story of heartbreak and betrayal. We met through mutual friends, hitting it off immediately, and soon became inseparable. Our relationship felt natural, effortless. Two people drawn together by a shared sense of humor, mutual dreams, and the kind of love that made me feel like I'd finally found my home. She was my partner, my best friend, the person I trusted above all others. Our life together seemed perfect. We bought a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by friendly neighbors and a small community that felt like an extended family. It wasn't long before we settled into the rhythms of marriage. Weekend projects around the house, movie nights, dinners with friends. I thought we had built something solid, something that would last a lifetime. But as the years passed, I began to notice changes in Rachel, subtle shifts that seemed harmless at first but slowly grew more concerning. She became more withdrawn, spending long hours on her phone, often texting or laughing at messages she wouldn't share with me. When I'd ask, she'd say it was just a group chat with friends. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was telling me the truth. But something in the back of my mind nagged at me, a quiet voice I couldn't ignore. Then there was our neighbor, Chris. He was around our age, single and friendly enough, often stopping by to chat or lend a hand with repairs around the house. I didn't think much of his visits at first. He was just a helpful neighbor, someone who seemed like a good guy. But as time went on, I noticed Rachel's demeanor change whenever he was around. She'd laugh a little too easily at his jokes, find excuses to be outside when he was, and the two of them often seemed deep in conversation. One evening, I saw them chatting by the fence, and something in her expression caught my attention. It wasn't the look of a casual friend. It was something more, an intensity that made my stomach twist with an emotion I hadn't felt before: suspicion. As the days went by, that feeling of suspicion grew, gnawing at me every time I saw them together. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Rachel was my wife and Chris was just a neighbor, someone who was friendly, maybe even a bit too friendly, but harmless. I reminded myself of all the trust we'd built over the years. But the way Rachel started to act around him kept nagging at me. She seemed happier, more engaged, like she was eagerly waiting for the next chance to see him. One night, as we were having dinner, I decided to bring it up casually to gauge her reaction. "I've noticed you and Chris have been spending a lot of time chatting lately," I said, forcing a smile as I tried to keep my tone light. "What's he like? You seem to get along well." She looked up, slightly startled, before quickly recovering with a laugh. "Oh, come on, he's just a nice guy. It's good to have friends in the neighborhood, don't you think?" She shrugged, but her response felt too quick, too practiced. There was a defensiveness in her tone that set off alarms in my mind. "Of course," I replied, trying not to let my unease show. "It's just that you two seem close. I hadn't noticed you talking to any of the other neighbors like that." Rachel rolled her eyes, brushing off my comment with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're being ridiculous," she said, dismissively. "Chris is just a friend. Besides, it's not like I spend all my time with him." But that conversation left me with more questions than answers. I could feel a distance growing between us, an invisible wall she had built, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started paying closer attention, noticing how often she'd run errands that seemed to take longer than usual, or how she'd go outside for long phone calls, her voice barely a whisper. The cracks in our marriage, once invisible, were now too obvious to ignore. As the weeks passed, my suspicions only deepened. Rachel was spending more time outside or in the backyard, where she often bumped into Chris. Their laughter would drift through the open windows, a constant reminder of the growing distance between us. It felt as if they had their own little world, a place I wasn't welcome, and each time I heard them talking, a sense of dread washed over me. One night, after Rachel had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the living room, my mind racing with questions. I thought about confronting her directly, demanding answers, but I didn't want to accuse her without proof. I wanted to trust her, I wanted to believe that my fears were unfounded, that I was overreacting. But my instincts told me otherwise. That's when I had an idea, one that filled me with equal parts guilt and resolve. I decided to check our home security cameras. We had a system set up for safety, mostly covering the backyard and front porch, and I realized that they might hold the answers I was looking for. My hands shook as I accessed the camera footage, feeling a surge of guilt. But I told myself that I deserved to know the truth. The footage started off innocently enough. It showed Rachel tending to the garden, chatting briefly with Chris, or simply enjoying a quiet evening outside. But then, as I skipped forward, I stumbled upon a scene that made my heart stop. Late one evening, when I had been out of town for work, Rachel and Chris were in the backyard, talking closely. She laughed, leaning in as he placed a hand on her shoulder. The next moment, they kissed, a long, lingering kiss that shattered any doubt I had left. I sat there, frozen, watching the footage in disbelief. The truth was undeniable, staring back at me through the screen. Rachel was having an affair, and she hadn't even tried to hide it, not really. They'd brought it into our home, into the place I'd believed was safe. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air, struggling to process what I'd just seen. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living in a fog, barely able to focus on anything beyond the betrayal I'd uncovered. Every time I looked at Rachel, all I could see was that moment in the backyard, her and Chris sharing an intimacy that should have been ours. I was torn between anger and heartbreak, wanting to confront her, to demand answers, but something held me back. I needed to think this through, to figure out how I wanted to handle it without letting my emotions take over. I spent sleepless nights replaying everything in my mind, searching for signs I'd missed, moments that hinted at the truth. The laughter, the inside jokes, the lingering glances. How had I been so blind? I thought about our marriage, the years we'd spent building a life together, and it was painful to realize that somewhere along the way, she'd chosen someone else over me. The person I trusted most had turned into someone I no longer recognized. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of our living room, a new resolve began to take shape. I wasn't just going to confront her. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to understand the depth of the betrayal she had brought into our lives. I wanted to end this on my terms, not as the hurt, blindsided husband, but as someone who could face the truth head-on. I began to make a plan. I'd gather the evidence, show her exactly what I'd found, and let her know that there was no hiding from the truth anymore. But I wasn't going to do it in the heat of anger. I'd stay calm, controlled. I wanted her to feel the full impact of what she'd done, to face the consequences without any chance to twist the narrative. With each day, my plan took shape, and with it, I felt a strange sense of strength. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about reclaiming my dignity, taking control of a situation that had felt so completely out of my hands. I spent the next few days collecting everything I needed. I saved the footage from the backyard camera, took screenshots of suspicious texts I'd found on her phone when she wasn't looking, and documented the times and dates of her meetings with Chris. Each piece of evidence was like a small victory, a reminder that I was no longer in the dark. I was taking back control, preparing for the moment when I would finally confront her with the truth. The hardest part was pretending that everything was normal. I had to act as if nothing had changed, as if I didn't know about the betrayal happening right under my nose. It was exhausting, draining every ounce of patience I had. But I knew that if I showed any hint of suspicion, she might try to cover her tracks or deny everything. I wanted her to be blindsided, to feel the shock of being caught, just as I had felt it when I first discovered the truth. Finally, the day came. I'd chosen a quiet Saturday afternoon, a time when I knew we wouldn't be interrupted. I waited until she'd settled into the living room, flipping through a magazine with a relaxed, carefree expression that only fueled my resolve. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and walked over, holding the folder with all the evidence I'd gathered. "Rachel," I began, my voice calm but firm. She looked up, surprised by my tone. "There's something we need to talk about." She put the magazine down, her expression shifting to one of slight confusion. Sure, she said, smiling uneasily. What's on your mind? Without a word, I placed the folder on the table in front of her. Open it, I said, my voice cold. It's time you face the truth. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder, her face paling as she flipped through the contents. The photos, the messages, the video footage. It was all there, laid out in stark detail, a timeline of her betrayal. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and guilt, but she said nothing. There was no defense, no excuse that could justify what she'd done. For a long, tense moment, Rachel just sat there, staring down at the evidence, her face a mixture of disbelief and shame. I could see her struggling to process the fact that her secret was out, that there was no hiding anymore. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. Paul, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I never meant for you to find out like this. I felt a bitter smile form on my lips, though there was no humor in it. Not like this? Did you even mean for me to find out at all, Rachel? I kept my voice steady, though every word was laced with the anger and hurt I'd been holding back. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And this is what you chose to do with it. She looked away, biting her lip, as if searching for something to say that might lessen the impact of her betrayal. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said finally, her voice shaking. It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt you. I swear. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. You didn't mean to hurt me? Rachel, this isn't something that just happens. This was a choice. You chose to betray me, to break every promise we ever made to each other. And for what? For some cheap thrill with the neighbor. She flinched at my words, her face crumpling as she fought back tears. But I felt no sympathy for her. She hadn't thought of me, of our life together, when she was sneaking around with Chris. She'd only thought of herself. Paul, please, she said, reaching out as if to touch my hand. I know I messed up, but maybe we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it together. I don't want to lose you. I pulled my hand back, keeping my expression cold. There's nothing left to fix, Rachel. You destroyed everything the moment you decided I wasn't enough. I deserve better than this, better than someone who would throw away our marriage for whatever this was. Her eyes filled with desperation as she realized the finality of my words. But I was done. I was done with the lies, the betrayal, the pain. I knew that whatever happened next, I would face it on my terms, free from the deception that had tainted our life together. Rachel sat there, stunned, her eyes filling with tears as she realized just how deeply she'd shattered our marriage. Paul, please, she pleaded, her voice breaking. I know I made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. But we have years together. Memories? Isn't there anything I can do to make this right? Her words washed over me, but they had no effect. The promises, the apologies, they all felt empty now. I had given her my trust, my loyalty, and in return, she'd betrayed me in the worst way possible. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of finality that told me I'd already made my decision. Rachel, I want you to understand something, I said, my voice steady. There's no coming back from this. You've broken something that can't be fixed, something that no amount of apologies or promises can make whole again. The trust is gone, and without trust, there's nothing left between us. She looked at me, her face pale, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Paul, please, I love you. I don't want to lose you. I shook my head, feeling a sense of detachment. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Love isn't just words, it's actions, choices. And you made your choice when you let him into our life, into our home. I paused, my voice growing cold. I'll be moving out. I'll start the divorce process. This is over. Her face crumpled, and she began to cry, but I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. I stood up, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal, and walked out of the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt free from the lies, the deceit, and the pain that had haunted me for weeks. In the days that followed, I started to put my life back together, piece by piece. Moving out was harder than I expected. Not because of leaving Rachel, but because of leaving behind the home we had built together. Every room, every piece of furniture held memories of a life I thought was real. But now, those memories felt hollow, tainted by the betrayal that had turned our life into a lie. Rachel tried reaching out to me, sending messages, apologizing over and over, each message a plea for a second chance. She said she'd do anything to fix things, that she couldn't imagine her life without me. But her words felt empty now, like a script she'd memorized to try and ease her own guilt. I ignored her messages, knowing that no amount of apologies could erase the betrayal. I focused on myself, reconnecting with friends, spending time with family, and rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten. I began to realize how much I'd sacrificed in that marriage, how much I'd ignored my own happiness to keep things together. I felt like I was coming back to life, free from the constant worry and doubt that had haunted me for so long. I also met with a lawyer to finalize the divorce. It was painful, closing this chapter of my life, but with each step, I felt stronger, more in control. I was reclaiming my future, a future that no longer included Rachel and the deceit she had brought into my life. It was a strange feeling, bittersweet but empowering, knowing that I was moving forward on my terms. Each day, the pain of betrayal grew a little quieter, replaced by a sense of resilience I hadn't known I had. I knew it would take time to fully heal, but I was willing to face it head-on, without regret. As the weeks went by, I found myself adjusting to this new life with a surprising sense of peace. I'd moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, a space that was entirely mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly independent. I no longer had to wonder, to question, or to doubt. I was free to make decisions solely for myself, to create a future that wasn't weighed down by secrets. I threw myself into things I hadn't made time for before. I picked up old hobbies, hiking, photography, woodworking, and spent weekends exploring new trails, capturing moments in nature, and building small projects in my apartment. Each day felt like another step forward, a small victory over the heartache that had once dominated my life. My friends noticed the change too, commenting on how I seemed lighter, more at ease. They had been there through it all, offering support, encouraging me to keep going, to focus on the future instead of the past. Rachel continued to reach out now and then, each message a reminder of the life I'd left behind. But I no longer felt the urge to respond, no longer felt bound to her or the apologies she offered. I realized that my silence was as much for me as it was for her. It was my way of letting go, of saying goodbye to a part of my life that no longer served me. Then, one evening, as I was having coffee with an old friend, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. We talked about everything: work, life, and even the heartbreak I'd endured. My friend looked at me with a smile and said, "You're finally back, Paul. The real you." In that moment, I knew they were right. I had come through the fire and emerged stronger, more resilient. The betrayal no longer defined me. It had become just one chapter in a story I was still writing. And as I left the coffee shop that night, I felt a renewed sense of hope, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Months passed, and the pain that once felt unbearable had faded into a distant memory. My life was now filled with new routines, new friendships, and the quiet satisfaction of having reclaimed my independence. I was finally able to look back on the marriage with a sense of peace, no longer haunted by the betrayal but grateful for the lessons I'd learned. I'd discovered a strength within myself, a resilience that I hadn't known existed, and it gave me confidence that I could face anything life threw at me. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood near my apartment, I ran into an old acquaintance from my past, Sarah, a friend from college whom I hadn't seen in years. We spent hours catching up, reminiscing about old times, laughing in a way I hadn't in a long while. There was an ease between us, a familiarity that felt comforting, and over the next few weeks, we continued to meet up, sharing stories and rediscovering the bond we'd once had. With Sarah, there were no expectations, no pressure. We simply enjoyed each other's company, talking about our lives, our dreams, our struggles. Slowly, I felt a warmth growing in my heart, a feeling of possibility that I hadn't thought I'd ever experience again. It wasn't the same as what I'd had before. It was something new, something founded on mutual respect and understanding, on the honesty that had been missing in my marriage. Standing on my balcony one evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I realized that I was ready for whatever came next. The pain of the past was gone, replaced by a quiet strength and a newfound openness to life's surprises. I no longer defined myself by the betrayal or the heartbreak. Instead, I saw myself as someone who had endured, who had rebuilt, and who was ready to embrace the future with open arms. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, knowing that my life was truly mine again, and that this new chapter was just beginning.